they're not just things that impact your bottom line, though those are immediately like tariffs. But there are things where you can't trust the rule of law and you don't know if a contract you have with the government can be respected or if your industry could be influenced by insider traders that are getting information.
What is the question on every business leader's mind right now? 3BL's video series with TriplePundit cuts through the chaos and helps you navigate responsible business. Each episode dives into the questions keeping leaders up at night, breaking down trends, cutting through noise, and uncovering what's really shaping the future.
From rising tariffs to political pushback against major institutions, U.S. businesses operate in an increasingly unstable and uncertain environment. With a weakening system of checks and balances, how can business leaders respond to protect their competitiveness and push back without fear of retaliation? Today, we're excited to be joined by Daniella Ballou-Aares, founder and CEO of the Leadership Now Project, a pro-democracy business coalition, to dive into these questions and more. Daniella, thanks so much for being with us today.
Pleasure to be here, Mary. Thanks for having me.
Executive actions are all over our newsfeed, from tariffs to attacks on ESG and DE&I to the treatment of immigrant communities. How does all of this impact the ability of U.S. businesses to compete on a global stage?
Yeah. Look, the impact right now is pretty profound, as you've raised. We just did, a couple of weeks ago, Leadership Now did a poll with Harris of executives across the country, and we found that 80% of executives were very concerned about the current political and economic environment, and that went across parties. And 45% were already seeing the negative impact of executive orders. So what you're hearing in your kind of networks is very representative, really, of across the country, of the uncertainty, instability that many companies are feeling. And I think the threat to U.S. competitiveness that we're seeing is multifaceted, right? And it's both the tariffs, the erosion of historic alliances globally, and it's also things like the impact on talent pipelines and innovation by pullback from universities in various ways, including funding. So, I think we're in a context where there are a lot of risks for businesses across the board, and it is a moment where being smart about identifying the risk, but then really also being strategic about how do you mitigate them and what are ways that business can play an effective role in trying to, prevent more erosion of our competitiveness is something we think a lot about and look forward to discussing further.
And I'd love to learn a bit more about Leadership Now's survey of senior business leaders. Can you tell us a bit more about what you've found there and what you're hearing from leaders right now about how this environment is impacting them?
Yeah, so we decided to do the poll because, things were moving so quickly and we were coming to 100 days of the administration, and we wanted to understand what sentiment was. I think that the big insights were the ones that I shared around an impact across industries, executive orders impacting many. And I think what we see practically how that's playing out. If I look at Leadership Now as membership, for instance, which is across the country, we have members in more than 25 states. Tom Florsheim, from Florsheim Shoes, is a member in Wisconsin. And, what he and the footwear industry has seen as a whole, which is not dissimilar to a lot of industries that are consumer product industries in the U.S., is, of course, they import a lot from China and Vietnam as part of their shoes, whether companies manufacture partially in the U.S. or manufacture in other countries. These are U.S. companies. They have big operations, and it was going to immediately impact the bottom line, not only of Florsheim, but of the 700 companies that are part of the U.S. Footwear Association. So they started really proactively messaging, pushing back on the administration, saying what an impact this would be on their companies. Tom himself was out there publicly in Wisconsin, in the press and otherwise. And I think that's important because there is, you're hearing a lot of the fear factor that, if you say anything that's pushing back on the administration, that is going to be an issue. But my experience so far is actually largely that when there's been pushback, it actually has led to changes. I mean, there have been massive pushback on tariffs. That's not a surprise that there's been some pullback from them. So, I think part of the roadmap here is, coalitions. Tom on his own, Florsheim, couldn't have done this, but as part of the Footwear Industry Association, they can really have an impact. So I think industry associations, new kinds of coalitions that can form are going to be really critical, not only in kind of immediate impacts like tariffs, but in the longer term issues that we're seeing that, for instance, seek to tell companies who they can hire, how they do their hiring and what their what policies they can have around diversity or otherwise. I think we have to be really careful about companies, too quickly rushing to meet what they expect an administration need is and not kind of being true to their operations and values.
Absolutely. And looking at that example, of how the footwear industry has stood up, I wonder what you may recommend for business leaders who are concerned about government overreach. How can they balance standing up with a potential fear of retaliation?
I think you always have to be smart about how, it's not just, let me go out there on every issue. And frankly, that is something we would have said before the election, right? That, there was, I think, element of business being called on to engage on many, many issues. And there is, I think some of that led to blowback in a way that was unhelpful. But there's many issues that are core to business. I think Costco is an interesting example, right? Where their board said, look, we've had longstanding diversity initiatives. We're not going to pull back on those. We're not going to be scared to say the word DEI. Now, I don't think many companies are not using that terminology anymore. And the reality is the moment for the change in terminology is not the end of the world in all areas, though I think we have to be really careful about efforts like word policing on issues. But at the core, companies like Costco, who have had a real core commitment to diversity, when they felt under pressure, including from state attorney generals that were saying, okay, your hiring practices might not be consistent with policy, et cetera, they felt very comfortable saying, look, we hire the best talent, but part of that is recognizing the value of diversity in our workforce, and we're going to stand with that. And they saw a lot of benefit, both from customers and employees in that. We saw Marriott as well as an interesting example of a company that kind of stood by its commitment to diversity. But I think these were companies that had like a deep commitment, like for a very long time. These were not superficial commitments. And I think that's the key, is where when something has been superficial, then it's the most vulnerable for attack. And also, as a company, assessing how depending on who you are as a company, can you do something on your own or with others? One of the things that we look at is what happens to businesses when there is erosion of rule of law. And that, unfortunately, we've seen in history in a lot of places, including a recent history like Hungary and Turkey, is that you really have to be careful not to obey in advance, so to speak, right? Not to do things that you really are forecasting might be an issue, but you're not really legally bound to do. And that just makes erosion faster of your ability to make decisions as a company. And at the end, this is all about can companies make the best decisions about what's going to be effective for their company and for their growth and for their teams? And it's really sad that that's getting undermined. And I think we have to do all we can to protect that.
And, we still hear this narrative in the media consistently that, businesses are staying silent on these issues. They really aren't speaking out like they were maybe in 2016 or so. But based on the examples you've just shared, that's not exactly true, right? I wonder if you have any theories about why this theory has persisted and what you might suggest to leaders who are kind of looking around and thinking, oh, well, my peers aren't saying anything. How can I say anything? How can I push back? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I do think the perception that business is being entirely silent is overstated. It's not it is not founded in concerns that aren't entirely inaccurate. You're not seeing kind of widespread pushback in every area. But I think when you get specific about particular policy issues that are impacting industries like tariffs, for instance, like what's happening in healthcare, there's now a coalition of chambers of commerce, including Boston, around the pullback in research funding for healthcare, right? So that's an example of where, there's a very specific a set of industry actors that are pushing back. I think, frankly, a lot of press on business is very focused on a very short list of name brand CEOs. I mean, Musk obviously being one of them, but you would say Schwartzman, Jamie Dimon, an extraordinary short list, Bezos, right? And certainly a short list of actors where, of course, we have tens of thousands of executives in this country. We have thousands of CEOs, et cetera. And so I think it is important to give that broader view that there's a lot of different ways that companies are responding. And also that there's a lot of things that happen that aren't public statements, right? I mean, that is not the only way to have an impact. I do think engaging and pushing back in small and large ways, or seeking to, defend your industry's interest, doesn't always involve a large public statement that's going to be covered in the national press. So anyway, I think it's just really important that I like to highlight the examples of where businesses have taken a proactive stance and have not seen massive retribution at all, or have not seen, they've just seen success. I mean, you look at in the law firm example, which are companies, right? Perkins Coie had a executive order against it, and it's fought it, and it has won in the courts, at least in the first round, that said this executive order was illegal. And other law firms capitulated, but what I hear from our members who hire lawyers all the time, that the ones who capitulated, they have a real question about their ability to defend their interests. I've seen companies switch firms because they were concerned about their ability to defend their interests. So yeah, it's a much more nuanced picture, but of course I would always like to see more leadership and help find ways for business leaders to be strategic in the leadership they provide.
So many important points. I think that the big public statement is what people often think of, right? When they think about pushing back, it's like, oh, I have to put a statement out. There's so many other ways to engage. And I think folks also sometimes fail to remember that staying silent, not doing anything is not always a risk-free option either. So I wonder, based on these examples, what really the top pieces of advice you might give to business leaders who are uncertain about the next step to take, about how they might kind of move off the sidelines if they haven't done anything yet, how to really stand up for their interests and things that they think are impacting their business.
Yeah. Look, I think this is a moment to engage with peer companies who are like-minded, to find shared interests in your industry, across industries, and then really to engage with your political leaders. That often starts locally, right? It's with your state and local officials, it's with governors, it's with attorney generals. We've been engaging with attorney generals, for instance, to in our state chapters, to understand what are the risk factors that are being created. I mean, there are real tensions right now between attorney generals and the federal government, and attorney generals can be important in protecting funding and pushing back on areas where the federal government is undermining states' ability to fund or make its own decisions. So I think there are figuring out the allies in government, working in coalition with your industry, and then really knowing what are non-negotiables, what is really core to your organization and business that you would find particularly detrimental and that you wouldn't be willing to compromise on. And I think if you think through those, they're not just things that impact your bottom line, though those are immediately, like tariffs. But there are things where you can't trust the rule of law and you don't know if a contract you have with the government can be respected, or if your industry could be influenced by insider traders that are getting information from political actors. I mean, it's pretty profound. It gets pretty profound pretty quickly what the erosion of rule of law can have an impact on. And we really think it's important to be prepared for that, be ready to respond, and work in kind of your current coalitions and maybe some unlikely coalitions to push back if and when it's needed.
Absolutely. Daniella, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Anyone who's interested in checking out Leadership Now's recent research can go to leadershipnowproject.org. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us today.
Thanks so much, Mary. And feel free to follow us on LinkedIn as well. And we really, work to try to keep our members and broader business executive audiences informed about what's happening in our political system. So pleasure to be here. Thanks again.
A lot to keep up with for sure. Thank you.